Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Catherine Croston, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator of the Art Gallery of Alberta. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are hosting this event from Edmonton, Amasquatchie Waskahikan, in Treaty 6 territory and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We acknowledge this as the traditional and ancestral home of the Nahiawak, Cree, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Dene, and Métis peoples, and acknowledge the many Indigenous, First Nations, and Inuit people who make Alberta their home today. We know that this acknowledgement is just one small recognition of the work we need to do to address and reverse the ongoing impacts of colonization. Our thoughts are with the people of the Tecumseh Wampum First Nation in Kamloops for the traumas that were forced upon them in the past and that they continue to endure today. Tonight's talk by Zainub Verjee, The Aga Khan Garden, A Site of History and Diplomacy, is the first in a series of discussions about gardens that we are organizing this summer in association with our exhibition, Cornelia Oberlander, Genius Loci. This exhibition explores the work of the internationally renowned Canadian landscape architect, who from the 1950s until the present has revealed new ways of understanding the human connection to the natural environment. I would like to extend our most sincere condolences to the family and friends of Cornelia Oberlander. It was with great regret that we learned of her passing on May 22nd, just a month before her 100th birthday. We are so very grateful that Cornelia was able to play an active role in the development of our exhibition and upcoming publication. And I think we were able to realize, and I'm thankful that we were able to realize both within her lifetime. It is now my honor to be able to introduce Zainub Verjee, a thought leader, persuasive champion of arts, and advocate for artists' rights. Zainub Verjee has over 4 decades built a formidable reputation as an artist, writer, critic, cultural administrator, and public intellectual in Canada and internationally. A firm believer that art is a public good, she has contributed to international instruments of culture, such as the status of the artist and cultural diversity, and building institutions such as the British Columbia Arts Council. As an annotator, she is engaged with different stakeholders to observe, critique, and analyze the quotidian practices of the art and culture sector to actively work towards engaged public debate and conversations. Her work as a cultural bureaucrat, cultural diplomat, artist, activist, and writer is consistent and contiguous with what might be termed a critical transversal aesthetic. Her recent commentary on museums at a crossroads in Galleries West magazine generated a lot of traction. Today's talk is representative of her sustained research interests in water and gardens, and these thematic inquiries are part of her forthcoming book titled The Arts and International Relations, Art, Artists, Networks, Art Institutions. A sought-after speaker in the next few weeks, Zainub will be delivering a keynote address at the London Asia Arts World Conference hosted by the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, a scholarly centre in London. Later in the month, her solo exhibition, Speech Acts, Zainub Verjee, will be opening at Centre A, the Vancouver International Centre for Contemporary Asian Art. Currently, her work is also part of the exhibition Engaging Creativities, Art in the Pandemic, hosted by the Royal Society of Canada and the University of Alberta. Among many awards and honors, in 2020, Zainub Verjee received the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts for outstanding contribution. And this year, OCAD University conferred her with an honorary doctorate. She was appointed as a McLaughlin College Fellow at York University and recently chosen as a mentor with the prestigious Action Canada Fellowship, a 10-month public policy leadership program that aims to enhance youth leaders' understanding of the country and public policy for the cohort of 2021 to 2022. Zainub was the executive director of the Western Front in Vancouver and has held positions at the Canada Council for the Arts, the Department of Canadian Heritage, and the City of Mississauga. She is currently executive director of Galleries Ontario Galleries, a voice of art galleries and museums in Canada. Before I turn things over to our distinguished guest speaker, just a few notes. Zainub will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, following which she will answer questions. And please enter all of your questions using the chat function. As well, we'll be posting a survey link in the chat. It would be really great if you could provide your feedback in the chat in that survey before you leave. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Poole Family Foundation at the Edmonton Community Foundation, who support the Poole Center of Design at the AGA. Our Cornelia Oberlander exhibition and this Summer Garden Talk series are presented as part of our Poole Center of Design programming. I would also like to thank EPCOR, who provides support for all AGA online programming through their Heart and Soul Fund. Now, please join me in welcoming Zainub Verjee.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Catherine, for your kind words and gracious invitation to speak at this forum today. I'm really honored to be part of this public programming, and I want to also thank the team at the Art Gallery of Alberta. I live and work on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinabeg, and the Huron-Wendat. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. We're all joining today from different locations, and I encourage you to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of your area. With the passing of Cornelia Oberlander, this talk and the upcoming exhibition, Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, Genius Loci, becomes even more special. This exhibition explores the work of the Canadian landscape architect who, from the 1950s until the present, has revealed new means of understanding the human connection to the natural environment. In the context of this exhibition, I will be speaking on the Aga Khan Garden and will explore the meaning of landscape and its semantic valency in Islamic culture. Further, I'll foreground the idea of gardens as the leitmotif of landscape planning, its use in statecraft and diplomacy. Now, before I begin the talk, though, I would like to acknowledge a few individuals who have been very supportive in this endeavor. Thank you to Nurjan Mabani. I want to thank Dr. Lee Foote, Professor Emeritus and ex-director at the University of Alberta Botanical Garden from 2011 to 2020. And he graciously shared images and stories of the making of the Aga Khan Garden, and I really appreciated that. I also want to thank Zara Somani, President of the Ismaili Council of Edmonton, for her continuing support of my work. I'd also like to thank Narendra Pajkere for stimulating intellectual insights. And finally, I want to thank Fahim Somani, who did this artwork for this presentation at very short notice. A fine artist, we worked together at the International Art Gallery in Lisbon as part of the Diamond Jubilee Arts Festival. And this is a square Kufic calligraphy, and it says Bismillah, top to bottom, and has a mirror image which is reflecting bottom to top. Now I see the resonance of the geometry of the garden in this image. On a more somber note, I want to quote, "We know there are lots of sites similar to Kamloops that are going to come to light in the future. We need to begin to prepare ourselves for that. Those that are survivors and intergenerational survivors need to understand that this information is important for all of Canada to understand the magnitude of the truth of this experience." These are the words, and we must heed them, of the retired Senator Sinclair, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As all Canadians and the world, we must be together in this healing and help survivors to gather their stories and memories. On May 22nd, Cornelia Hahn Oberlander passed away at the age of 99 in Vancouver, an institution, indeed, in the field of landscape architecture. She said in a 2018 piece, quote, "My passion is to be with nature and introduce people to it from all levels of society. I believe in the therapeutic effects of greenery on the human soul. Now, the spirit of a place depends upon the special relationship things in that place share with each other. The genius loci offers a conceptual connection between the exhibition and my talk on the Aga Khan Garden. Genius loci emerges from the work of Malcolm Quantrill, who speaks about an environmental framework. The genius loci of a place, according to him, possesses both general characteristics of a place, its presence, and more detailed features, its identity. It is not dependent only on visible elements, but carries an underlying metaphysical order. D. Fairchild Ruggles, a professor of landscape history and an author of a definitive book on Islamic gardens and landscapes, makes a very fundamental point. Ruggles says that gardens and landscapes are elusive subjects. They are positioned in both space and time, yet belong to neither exclusively, because they are simultaneously a living presence and a memory. However, the garden is thus always the product of a society that defines it and places it within a discourse of space, and they enter either consciously or subconsciously into the shared cultural imagination. Thus, the garden emerges as the in-between space, between the physical and imaginative. In that sense, landscape and garden can become part of what Malcolm Quantrill calls an environmental framework. So let's move forward and let's take a snapshot of approaches to this idea of landscape. Now, through my art practice, I've been engaged with the idea of landscape. And what you see here is a still from my work, Écoute s'il pleut, a video poem which explores time and space, allowing the viewer to experience a moment and the fullness of silence. This work was, it's a short work of 7.34 minutes. It was made in 1993 and became part of the new Canadian video exhibition at MoMA, New York, and later Traversing Territory Part 2, which was road movies in a post-colonial landscape, and it was curated by Judith Mastai for the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art in 1997. And so what I'm alluding to here is that there are multiple approaches to this idea of landscape. So this assemblage of approaches to landscape very clearly identifies that it is not an easy task to pinpoint one element as a dominant lens. You can't just pinpoint on one element as a dominant lens. And this schema illustrates the point. And I will not elaborate on each, but I will say this, that landscape is not simply what we see, but a way of seeing. We see it with our eye, but interpret it with our mind and ascribe values to landscape for intangible spiritual reasons. Landscape can therefore be seen as a cultural construct in which our sense of place and memories are embedded. Now, similarly, a historical landscape captures our sense of place and heritage, and it's not an isolated experience. But let's go dig a little bit further. The idea of landscape is a Western construct. Conceptually, it is rooted in the Renaissance, as Europe moved into the early modernity period by the 16th century. And during this early modern period, the major transformative process unfurled both at an individual level and within society as a whole. At the heart of this transformation lies the idea that one form of individual habitus or social organization becomes the dominant expression. And what I'm alluding to is the making of the urban and rural. Both like landscape, are very Eurocentric ideas. It was during the Renaissance that the focus shifted from the enclosed, walled gardens of monasteries and palaces towards the outlying landscape and distant horizons. And what this shift emphasized was the idea of the controlling view of the surrounding countryside. And this is where we notice the emergence of the scenic and visual dimensions of landscape. This spread across Europe, and one can see the outward gaze and grand design scale, which is best manifest in the French formal landscape. And of course, a good example of this is Versailles, Jardin du Château de Versailles. The geometrically ordered garden layout dwarfed the palace in scale and provided a vista that stretched the horizon. During the course of this period, as the wider countryside was appropriated by the privileged few, landscape became a means of expressing power and signifying control. This manifested not only in the formal ordering of the landscape, but more importantly, that the visual appreciation was exclusive to the point from which the seeing occurred, i.e., that of the owner. Now, this is the central motif that informs the Western understanding of landscape, that core notion of the viewpoint, and hence control. The related idea of horizon, it's an important feature of this Western understanding, but is absent within the Islamic context. For instance, one can be at the center of a garden and be able to look in all directions, but never have one controlling view. But I'm going to come back to this later if time permits. Now, as we move forward, let's try to understand what a landscape is and how it is situated in the Islamic context of Muslim societies. Let's explore how landscape becomes a language to control our reality. The Western world began to orientalize the non-Western world through landscape by attributing meaning to it. Landscape was used to classify civilizations based on Western criteria. There's a linguistic concern regarding the absence of an equivalence to the word landscape in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, and other languages of the Muslim worlds. Jal Makhuzumi has noted that there is a lack of precisely equivalent words in Arabic for landscape as it is used in the West, and in Persian and Turkish as well. The most common words for landscape in Arabic are manzar or mashad, which refer to a view, a spectacle, a scene, a perspective, etc. And likewise in Persian, manzar refers to an object of sight. Another word Persian associated with landscape is ser, which can refer to walking or strolling in a place. Other words associated with landscape include dur nama. The Ottoman Turkish used the term manzara, and in contemporary Turkish, you see the word peyjaz from the French paysager, and the paysager literally means the landscape. In Urdu, sama can indicate a scene associated with the landscape. Professor M.R. Ghanun Perver's probing volume on translating the garden does not use the word landscape at all in its deep reflections on the language of contemporary Persian garden, its experience and meaning. The word landscape doesn't appear. Similarly, Lamia Latoury has retraced the development of the linguistic uses of words representing landscape in classical Arabic literature from the 8th to the 11th centuries, and draws explicit connections among landscape expressions, paysager, manzar, manshad. Basically, it's geography and culture. Now, Fairchild Ruggles has also explored this relationship, the relationship among sight, optics, and landscape in the Andalusian context, And as a next step in this process, Ruggles has drawn on research on vision, territory, and agronomic science in Andalusia into dialogue with critical literature on landscape in the Western social thought. Having said so, let's see how the Islamic gardens evolved. Islamic civilization brought dramatic changes to the landscape it inhabited. With the skillful acquisition and transportation of water, the parched lands of the Middle East and Northern Africa flourish with man-made verdant oases that not only transformed the economy with their agricultural products, but also became a powerful form of cultural expression. The techniques employed to effect this transformation originated among ancient Persians and Romans, but Muslim communities implemented them more broadly for a complex web of motivation having to do with the system of land ownership and labor, inheritance laws, taxation, urban growth, and an idealized vision of country life. It is in this context that one views this chronology of Islamic gardens. As we can see, the Islamic garden first began to manifest itself in the European garden culture in the 17th century. Enticed by the new concept of free expression of space and design, the influence percolated down to Florence and even the Royal Pavilion of Brighton in England. With the impetus of the 19th and 20th century modernity, the Islamic garden was othered and became part of the traditional. We see some examples of it in private gardens, such as the Shangri-La in Hawaii. I think this gives us a rich context to situate the Aga Khan Garden in the 21st century and understand what does this articulation of a classic Mughal garden imply. So what is a Mughal garden? I want to elaborate a bit here because it's really imperative to understand the complex history of the Mughal garden. The foremost characteristic of the Mughal garden is its own architecture and orderly planning, which Babur in the 16th century famously claimed to have introduced into an unclean and disorderly Hindustan, says Aga Khan. The Mughals came to India as the Timurids, founded by the Turco-Mongol warlord Timur, or Tamerlane as known in the West, circa 1370 to 1405. The Timurid dynasty ruled much of Iran and Central Asia for over a century, first from the Samarkand, now Uzbekistan, and then from Herat, now Afghanistan. In 18th century Europe, the Mughal dynasty was still known as the descendants of Tamerlane. Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, was of course the most familiar with the Timurid culture, having experienced it firsthand in both Central Asia and Herat. Nevertheless, his descendants, particularly Jahangir and Shah Jahan, both in the 17th century, took a renewed interest in affirming the relationship as it lent prestige and credibility to their own reigns. The most visible and enduring expression of the Mughal Timurid connection was, however, architecture. And from the beginning, the Mughals cultivated their patronage of building as a statement of their presence in India. Formally laid out gardens functioned for the Mughals as they did for the Timurids as open-air palaces and were indispensable for the Mughal lifestyle. The Mughals also made them the setting for their tombs. Babur calls his first garden at Agra, laid out in 1526, a Chahar Bahag. Like some of his earlier gardens in present-day Afghanistan, Babur used the term in its widest sense, not necessarily for a garden on a strict cross-axial plan, but rather for large architecturally planned gardens with intersecting raised paved walkways, platforms, and pools. After Babur, the Mughals did not use the term Chahar Bagh very much. In Shah Jahani's sources, it is employed metaphorically for the earth or the terrestrial Chahar Bagh of the world. Otherwise, a garden is usually just called the Bagh or the garden or Bagche for smaller versions. Still, we owe to the Mughals the grandest and most consistently planned Chahar Baghs in the entire history of garden architecture. Now here, what you can see are three different types of the Char Bagh. You can see at the top, the cross axial, which is the tomb of Humayun. At the bottom left is it's terraced, the Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir. And on the bottom right, which is the waterfront, the Lal Mahal in Bari, Rajasthan. Now, with this context that I've given you, let's listen to Brett Gastinger of the Nelson Byrd Woltz landscape architecture firm about the design imperatives of the Aga Khan Garden. Helen, do you think you could play the video for me, please?
The inspiration for the design really began with research. We had the opportunity, and we were charged to really look at the ways that this project could, in and of itself, the process of this project could contribute to global research and understanding and knowledge about Islamic garden traditions. The garden is really made up of three primary areas: the woodland bagh, the Chahar Bagh, and the bustan. The woodland bagh is a walk through the woods, and so this series of walkways leads one through this existing woods and also highlights the openings in the canopy created by some of the existing wetlands in that valley. The central court, or Chahar Bagh, is the second main area of the garden. It's the most constructed of the three. It is highlighted by a series of sunken gardens and plantings that will change color and texture throughout the year. And it is organized by a central fountain system that begins at an upper terrace, spills down over a series of terraces, and then flows across a large flat plain, a large court, towards the constructed wetlands and the Kala Pond beyond. The third main area of the garden is called the bustan, and it's a nod to the orchard landscapes of the Islamic world. And this series of plantings surrounds the Kala Pond, and the Kala Pond was an existing wetland that was formed into a pond some years ago. And this project gives us an opportunity to restore and enhance the capacity of the wetland plantings to contribute to the local ecology and also serve as an educational aspect of the garden. Really, the expertise and knowledge that's built here over many decades of experience has really been invaluable to the process.
The goal of the garden was to tell the story of the Edmonton landscape while at the same time forging a connection between contemporary Alberta and the Islamic world of the 16th and 17th century. And, you know, from what I spoke earlier and in the previous sections, we can see that it's a very rich history. And as Thomas Woltz says, who was the firm that built this, we were asked, quotes, we were asked to look beyond the bounds of the traditional Islamic garden and to develop ideas that would bring a new kind of relevancy in the 21st century, end quote. And I think the challenge was not to replicate, but really create something unique to this site. And that is exactly what was created. The northernmost Islamic garden with an appeal in all 4 seasons of the year. So the Aga Khan Garden is situated in the Alberta Parkland region, with the broad expanses of prairie and with shallow surface depression in ancient sand dunes that form the pothole wetlands. It is situated along with two other gardens, the Japanese and Indigenous garden, and all three share common soil and water, and the water flows laterally. The material used is very representative. The sandstones, given that it's situated in the sand dunes, the green granite, it came from Quebec, and it has Portugal limestones. One can see in the columns of the talar. And interestingly, the talar connects two different sand dunes. One of the botanical connectors that Dr. Foote mentioned when we were speaking was the rat root, also called sweet flag and or muskrat root plant. And this is a plant which actually is a connection across the Indigenous, American, and Muslim cultures. It grows in India, Central Asia, South Russia, and also in North America. In brief, what we see is that gardens are secular endeavors stemming from the practical need to organize the surrounding space, tame nature, enhance the earth's yield, and create a legible map on which to distribute natural resources. The removal of the garden from the broader context of landscape, agriculture, and water supply results in a limited and superficial view, giving extraordinary emphasis to religion and dynastic politics while ignoring other factors that contributed equally to garden form and meaning. And the Aga Khan Garden draws us to this very core of what a garden is in the 21st century. I'm going to ask Helen again to play a video just so that we can get a virtual tour of the garden. saying that although gardens are typically appreciated as peaceful spaces of apolitical serenity, here I wanted to highlight how gardens can provide new sights and sensibilities that complicate our understanding of diplomacy, war, and peace. And while gardens are a popular location for diplomatic performances, I mean, for example, the Treaty of Versailles, the global politics of gardens still remains under-researched in international relations. And I think it's imperative to take cognizance of gardens as objects of diplomacy, to examine gardens as contingent social constructions of social ordering and world ordering, which both shape and participate in global politics. In this forthcoming book of mine, I try to engage with the role of gardens in diplomacy and in matters of peacekeeping. And gardens here are a site, an institution, an enactment, and an encounter. In addition to analyzing gardens as sites of symbolic power, my book will also looks at them as a material modality where diplomacy, war, and peace are represented, performed, and experienced through more embodied, affective, and everyday encounters. Now, on a more philosophical note, I'd like to invoke this beautiful couplet penned by Allama Iqbal, Bahag-e-Bahist. In simpler terms, it invokes that there's still so much work to be done before one can return to paradise. And this resonates well with what philosopher Richard Harrison writes in Gardens, an essay on the human condition, and I'll quote, "We inhabit relatively permanent worlds that precede our birth and outlast our death, binding the generations together in a historical continuum. Work builds the world that makes us historical. The historical world, in turn, serves as the stage for human action, the deeds and speech from which human beings realize their potential for freedom and affirm their dignity in the radiance of the public square." In this respect, the Aga Khan Garden foregrounds its social impetus and invites all of us to engage in a cultural dialogue that brings together disparate populations towards a better tomorrow, sharing the beautiful and bountiful nature and offering a graceful stewardship of these lands. This poignant quote captures the very raison d'etre of gardens. Robert Harrison offers an exploration of our need to garden in the midst of plague, poverty, war, and our everyday lives, as a counterforce to history's deleterious drives. It is no surprise that Thomas Woltz, the principal of the firm, was reading Harrison when he was touring the Islamic and Mughal gardens on the insistence of His Highness the Aga Khan. A garden is a site of peace and reconciliation in the face of tragedy amidst us. It is in this context that the 4.8 hectare Aga Khan Garden in Alberta was gifted by His Highness the Aga Khan, and I think becomes more valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainub, for your presentation. She would like to hear more about the concept of viewpoint in Islamic gardens.
Okay. Yeah, so what I've understood in my reading and in my sort of study of this is that the viewpoint is really coming more from a Western context, this idea of having, this sort of panoramic view, and it's really coming out of a very Western idea of landscape in as part of a control mechanism, right? Whilst in the Islamic it's not really there. That's not the primary the thing, and so I think that this idea of landscape is really ordered in by the West, and it's classified in particular ways, and basically there's four things. In order for landscape to classify civilizations, there's criteria. These are the criteria defined by Western culture. There's four things. There needs to be one or several words for landscape. There needs to be a literature, oral or written, describing landscapes or extolling their beauty. There needs to be pictorial representations of landscapes, and there need to be pleasure gardens. But there's always this idea of this having this panoramic viewpoint with it. And so, very different sort of idea about what landscape is from the different cultures.
Thank you. And to go back to the question from Christine, her question was, yes, how do you think that children relate to the peaceful nature of the Islamic garden?
That's such a great question. I'm not sure I can say definitively how they do, but children are always amazing in that, and they feel things very really and state them. And I expect that any garden that is that serene and peaceful or reflective spaces must have some effect, as they do on us. So I can't say that I can per se really answer that. I'd say it can have the effect of being very therapeutic, but I would say that for everyone, right? It can put all of us in that very meditative, reflective space, and we can feel the silence, as well in those spaces. But I don't know. I can't say, exactly what that means. Maybe it helps us de-accelerate from the instant world that we live in.
I wonder, Zainab, in your closing remarks about the importance of gardens, culturally and as sites of meditation and reflection, if you think now the world in which we live, which is so complicated by, obviously in the last 18 months, the pandemic, but also by kind of acts of violence and the repercussions of histories of trauma. Do you see that gardens now will become more important for us, or something that we will begin to create more spaces that provide that for people?
I'd find it hard not to think that that would be. We will rediscover them in different ways, perhaps. We'll rediscover them in different ways, perhaps. They've always been with us, but maybe we'll build a new relationship as we build them. I mean, I'm just thinking of even all the crises around climate change and, how what is the stewardship of the land? How do we understand it? How do we work with it? And what can the Indigenous peoples teach us? What can we learn respectfully from them? And I think that even just the idea of urban farming, urban gardens, there's so many different things that we could be doing, and I think that in some of the things that I said, right, is like, in fact, the garden actually makes us. We're part of that making of the garden, and it also brings meaning for us. And you just think of like heirloom seeds, and preserving those and sort of fighting, the kind of taking over of our heritage that's occurred, and how food production has changed, so drastically, even in the last 30 years, let's say. So I do think that the pandemic has given us a moment to think about many things. But I would definitely say that, among the crises is the climate change, and how do we actually think of garden within that context, and what can we do to preserve and respectfully steward the land.
There is a question from Brittany about how you would include more haptic qualities in a garden.
Yeah, so we understand haptic to do with our senses, and I guess I always think of the garden that way, anyways, because I think it does. I'm not sure if I've understood the question, but from my perspective, I think that the visual it employs all your senses, and it can do. I mean, you know, I'm just thinking of the beautiful garden, even that at Banff, Catherine, that you know, of Mike McDonald's, the butterfly garden, right, where all the local plant species were built into the garden, and those plants specifically drew butterflies to that space, right? So there's many ways I think that we can think of light, of the connectors, of things that enlighten are literally our senses, bring them to life.
Right. There's someone who is asking, what is a haptic quality? Oh, qualities that you can touch and feel, that Brittany answered in the chat. It's interesting you mentioned Mike McDonald's gardens, because one of the other talks that we are doing in part of this series is a conversation about Mike McDonald's butterfly gardens. And the butterfly gardens in Alberta being, of course, one at the Banff Centre, but also the old Art Gallery of Alberta, under the name of the Edmonton Art Gallery, created a butterfly garden back in the early 2000s. So that conversation is coming up on July 22nd. And it's also interesting that OCC1, the Indigenous curatorial collective and exhibition space here in Edmonton, is rebuilding a garden inspired by Mike McDonald's butterfly gardens this summer. So yeah, very exciting. Well, thank you so much, Zainub. It's been a pleasure having you join us this evening. I've always enjoyed our conversations, and you know, now that we're entering into a time where Alberta is beautiful and warm and the restrictions are being lifted, that I think that many people should take any opportunity they have to go to see the Aga Khan Garden if they haven't been there before. It's, you know, the U of A gardens are a magical place with, you know, so much for people to experience. So thank you for giving us this kind of glimpse into those gardens and the history and how important they are for us as culture and society. So thank you so much.
Great, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I yet have to come to Alberta to see the gardens myself and meet you and everybody else. But yes, yeah. Thank you so much. And we, you know, I'm really sorry about all the technical difficulties as well, but hopefully people got most of it. I'm sure they did.
Yes, thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. And I do hope to see you in person soon.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye.